Great, and our next speaker is Kathryne Bomberger, who's the Director General of the International Commission on Missing Persons, ICMP, and she trained received her master's degree from George Washington University in International Relations with an emphasis on Middle Eastern studies. And she has also worked with the Organization for Security and Cooperation of Europe and the United Nations. And just recently, a tremendous honor, she received the Chevalier de Légion d'Honneur by the President of France. It's like being knighted in France for all of her efforts on working with missing persons. And although she's from the United States, she's worked many years overseas, and she's going to tell you a lot about her last several years working in Sarajevo, trying to identify many missing persons in the recent Balkan wars. And we are very, very happy to have her with us. Kathryne?
Good morning. Last but not least, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Marilyn. And I'd like to thank Douglas Ubelacher very much for putting this plenary session together. Again, Douglas also happens to be a member of ICMP's Steering Committee on Forensic Sciences, and we're very honored to have him as a member. I'd like to thank Marilyn and Mecki Prince, who's also a member of ICMP's Steering Committee on Forensic Sciences, for inviting me here today. It's an honor and a privilege to address you all at the AAFS. And I'd like to take note of the presentations already given by my colleagues, who I thought were excellent presentations. And I think you can see by the presentations that have been given thus far that we deal with a lot of horrific issues, a lot of horrific set of circumstances, very sad circumstances, which fill us not only with sadness, but also with anger. And I think my colleagues and many of the people that I work with and the colleagues here at this table, we're all committed to trying to help people in the world address these issues, whether it's missing persons or persons who have been tortured. And I just wanted to take note of that. It is very difficult work, and we're all committed to finding solutions to these issues, to these very important human rights issues. Many of you probably are not aware of this fact. This is a very little known, let's say, human rights issue, but in the world today, about 1 million people are missing from armed conflicts and violations of human rights. And I have to note, following Mr. Durate's presentation, that many of the people who are tortured are often then killed and hidden in a series of clandestine graves and mass graves. So the consequences, or what happens with torture, doesn't end in the prison. And many prisoners who go missing, many prisoners who eventually also go missing themselves. So this is a universal issue in which many, many people are affected. In addition to those people that are missing from wars and violations of human rights, which we do calculate is over 1 million people currently today that families are searching for, there are also persons, about 150,000 of them, that go missing from natural disasters. In addition, there are persons missing from human trafficking, drug-related violence, and other causes, other involuntary reasons, many of them related to horrific crimes that occur. My speech today will, or PowerPoint presentation, will focus primarily on the responsibility of states and state actors in taking responsibility for the issue of missing persons from armed conflict and crimes against humanity. So I won't be talking today, as I did yesterday, about persons missing from natural disasters. So the focus will be on really human rights abuses, crimes against humanity, genocide, and what states should do. I think Morris gave a very good presentation of the history of forensic intervention in Argentina and other places. But something happened in the 1990s that also is a seminal point, I think, in the history of addressing these cases. The creation of the International Criminal Court, the creation of the International Court for the former Yugoslavia are big steps, I think, in the history of trying to address these cases and ensuring that governments take responsibility for issues of persons missing from armed conflict and violations of human rights. So this begins to be a shift. As you noted, in the early 80s, in many cases, NGOs had to struggle, particularly in Argentina, to deal with these cases. So having a move by the 1990s really does represent a historical shift where we as society have begun to say, no, in fact, it's not only NGOs that have to work on their own. Governments must take responsibility for abuses that have been committed by by former regimes, by current regimes, by political actors acting on the behalf of certain regimes. But the question is, how do they do this? First, I wanted to give you a bit of background about ICMP in general. I'm sure most of you have never heard of us, and I thank Morris again for a very kind introduction to who we are. We were also created in the mid-1990s along with this, during this time period of the creation of the International Criminal Tribunal and the ICC. And our mandate is, in fact, to hold governments to account. We are an independent, intergovernmental, human rights, rule of law organization. In that regard, and again, going back to this theme of having governments take account or take responsibility for acts of atrocities, and particularly missing persons, our mandate is to make sure that they do. We do not intervene in their, we intervene in an effort to try to ensure that governments take that responsibility. We also work on the other end with civil society groups to ensure that they can hold their governments to account, that they learn, that they're educated about the process, that they understand what national or international legislation exists, and to give them the tools to be able to hold their governments to account. We also work with civil society organizations to try to empower them, to also try to get them to hold their governments to account, but to commemorate events of missing persons, which can often be difficult. We also build states, and this is what becomes complicated. What happens when a state decides to take the political will to engage in these efforts? I think we can look at Libya today. We see a change in regime from 42 years of Gaddafi's rule to suddenly a new administration, the Libyan National Transitional Council. They'll be holding elections soon, but right now there is an effort in Libya to address not only those missing from the recent conflict, but from the 42 years of abusive leadership or rule of Gaddafi, where thousands of people went missing as a consequence of actions taken during that regime. So the problem here is, what do governments do? How do they exhibit that political will to address these issues? So ICMP tries to assist governments in that regard. Once they've shown the political will to engage in this process, we assist them in building appropriate rule of law institutions. We also assist them in creating legislation. We also assist them in creating databases and archives that provide evidence, irrefutable evidence, not only of a person's identity, but of the circumstances of their disappearance. We also provide technical assistance, and this is what we're probably best known for. And yesterday, I don't know how many of you were here at the speeches that took place yesterday, but ICMP maintains a standing capacity where we have a DNA identification laboratory that is capable of making thousands and thousands of DNA-based identifications. So we try to assist governments with a technical process through a modern, integrated scientific approach to be able to account for persons missing. We've managed to lower the cost so that it is available to governments where we raise funds free of charge to be able to assist governments with these mass abuses, mass cases of missing persons. As I said, we pioneered the use of DNA testing. Again, this happened, beginning in the year 2000 when we made our first DNA match report. Today, we've assisted governments in making over 18,000 DNA-based identifications globally. We also help, as I mentioned earlier, empower the victims. The families of the missing play an incredibly important role in this process. So on the one hand, you have the government, which must take responsibility, but on the other hand, you have families struggling also, not knowing what their role in this process can be, and also afraid to participate in this process, given abuses that have occurred for decades against them. So to ask them to voluntarily participate in this process can often be a very scary proposition for them. And to a certain degree, I think we're at a point in 2012 where addressing these cases, and I think Dan also alluded to this, given the number of ministries and the ways that governments deal with this issue, it is kind of a Wild West situation. I mean, there are no rules, really, that we can talk about, or best practice principles where we can state these are the set of rules when following conflict or following abuses of human rights, states should engage in. There's nothing out there. So each state, once they have the political will, each state struggles to be able to address these cases.